Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of More to It. I am Todd Norton.
And I'm Jason McConnell. Hi.
We're going to have an awesome time today, and welcome you back. And we're really interested in having a conversation. Before we get going on today's topic, need to read, of course. Need to remind the viewers that the views, the thoughts, analysis, and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the authors and the podcast participants. They do not necessarily reflect the views of Boise State University, the University of Wyoming, or either of their governing bodies. No endorsement of the material contained in this podcast of those entities is implied. So welcome back, everybody. We're looking forward to another school year, 24-25 year coming up. So that is fantastic. And we're excited. We're in the middle of the presidential race, which is exciting. Lots of interesting stuff going on in governance. And toward that end, I asked Jason if he would spend some time talking to us about delegates and superdelegates. So Jason, here's my gig. I am not a governance expert. If you want to understand something about risk communication or crisis communication, I'd be happy to talk about that. I could talk about that, maybe not all day because it's not all day, but I could talk about it for a while. If you want to talk about project management, right, happy to talk about that. But when it comes to governance and politics processes, I'm interested, but I am not a terribly informed person. So I've been watching the Republican and the Democratic national conventions in the last month or so, right? And lots has happened in politics, of course. Nominee Trump chose J.D. Vance for his VP nominee, and Kamala Harris, right? Joe Biden stepped aside, and Kamala Harris became the presumptive nominee, and then the nominee, and chose Tim Walz? Walz?
Yeah.
Walz from Minnesota. All of that is interesting in of itself, but that's actually, I'm not interested at all talking about the partisan aspects of this. That's not what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is during that process, I heard a lot of conversation about delegates and superdelegates. So I did a little bit of research on my own, and I'm going to bring that up actually just really quickly because I think it's worth sharing. Sorry for the ads for our viewers. Don't know what to do about those. So I'm bringing up the example from the Democratic superdelegate rule changes for 2020, just because that's one of the sites I saw, and I wanted to go for nonpartisan sites to sort of to help me understand a little bit. So in my simple mind, I'm going to unshare for just a moment. In my simple brain, each state has a set of rules for the primary contest, and somebody gets voted on, right? And so each state has its own Democratic committee and Republican committee and so on and so forth. And they vote for a candidate, and then that vote is carried to the national convention where those delegates vote on somebody. So I'm going to pause there for a second. How could you, Jason, help us explain or help us understand the connection between state primaries and delegates in the first place?
Okay, so you got to think about the Republican and Democratic parties as like two giant clubs, and
Okay.
they've got their own rules. They've got their own rules for selecting who advances to the next level in the big operation. So, if the finish line from a voter's perspective is the November election, let's start working our way backwards from there. So in the November election, you got a nominee from each of the two major parties and then nominees from some of the minor parties too, showing up on a ballot on election day. We go to vote, or maybe we vote absentee ahead of time. Either way, those candidates, those nominees' names show up on the ballot and we get to choose from among them. Great. Most folks who are at least marginally in tune with elections understand that stuff as I just described it. Okay, but how do we get those nominees? All right, so each of the two parties have state level affiliates.
Okay.
So, for instance, the state parties in my home state of Texas, state parties in each of the 50 states. Okay. Each of those are going to have their own nominating contest. And for more states than not, that's called a primary. That's an election. But for some states, they don't call it a primary. They call it a caucus. And
Oh,
that's a
okay.
different animal entirely. We can talk about that if you want.
So that's
But
the Iowa
now I'm
caucus
getting,
we hear a lot about as an example.
yeah. Okay. So now we're getting right to the answer to your question a second ago. So, how do we jump from all of these primaries or caucuses? How do we jump from that all the way up the timeline to nominees squaring off against each other on the general election ballot for November? How do we do that? Okay. So these nominating conventions happen. The Democrats and the Republicans each do one. In years past, some of the larger minor parties in America have had conventions too. The Libertarian Party, for instance, occasionally holds a convention. The Green Party in the past has held a convention from time to time. Okay. So, what happens at these conventions? Well, there are rules, and the rules determine who gets to vote in those conventions. So, let me introduce some terminology. You've got delegates at these conventions who represent the people back home. So, for instance, each of the 50 states and the territories will have delegates to their party's convention. Okay, so now let's talk about who gets to vote and why. So, remember, I mentioned that each state is going to have a primary or a caucus. Each of the two parties then gets to send delegates to the national convention. Those delegates are bound by whatever the results were at the state level. So let's just say, for argument, candidate Joe Schmo wins the primary from state X for that party. So delegates from that party are bound to vote for Joe Schmo at their national convention.
Mm-hmm.
With me so far?
Yes.
Okay. So one category of delegate is the bound delegate. They are bound to vote the way their state voted. The other category is an unbound delegate. Unbound delegates don't have to vote the way their home state voted. They can do whatever they want. They can vote the same way as the bound delegates from their state. They can pick somebody out of a hat. They can do anything they want, vote wise, at the national convention. So the slang term on the street for an unbound delegate is super delegate.
Oh, so unbound
Those are
delegate
the
means
same.
super delegate.
Yeah. So the reason why the political nerds like me on the street refer to them as super delegates is they really do have this superpower that they are untethered to anything going on in their home state. And so at the conventions, it makes them something a little different.
So, question on that. I'm going to pause you just
Yeah.
real quick because I'm curious then. In principle or theoretically, do unbound delegates represent the party as opposed to the party in a state?
Okay, so
And that's not meant as criticism or good. I'm just trying to understand process.
So it's a fair question. What is the role of these people? So you're going to hear a lot of different explanations. If we were to jump on the interwebs right now and run a search in our search engine of choice, super delegate, we're going to get a bunch of commentary out there on what their role is. So some are going to say that their role is to represent the party. What is in the best interest of the party? Others are going to say, well, actually, they also have a role to pick someone that's in the best interest of the nation. Okay, so it might be worthwhile to rewind a little bit and ask the question, where did this come from? What's the deal? Super delegates, or rather unbound delegates, this really flows downstream from all of the chaos that was the Democratic National Convention in 1968. I believe that was Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so much strife and struggle, both in the convention, on the convention floor, and then outside on the street. It was an exceptionally contentious nominating convention. A lot of people today like to talk about consensus. Turns out there was not a consensus among the Democratic Party in 68 as to who their nominee should be. And so that disagreement between the party elites, the leadership within the party, both state level party leaders and then national party leaders, there was disagreement among those groups of folks, in addition to disagreement among those groups and what the majority of Democratic voters wanted as they had expressed it through primaries, caucuses, and things like that. And so you end up having this culminating event of argument, contentiousness in this convention in Chicago. And so after the 68 race, the Democratic Party decides to change its rules and to actually give some delegates the opportunity to vote differently from the constituency back home. And so that's how we end up with these unbound delegates, these super delegates. I promise I'm not trying to just pick on the Democrats. The Democratic Party has a very elaborate scheme for these kinds of folks. The Republican Party has taken a different approach. Although the Republicans similarly want party leadership at the state level to have some sort of voice in choosing the nominee. They want that crowd to have a voice at the national convention. For the Republicans, even those folks are bound by what their home state did in the primary or caucus in the first round of voting at the national convention. And then if there's no majority candidate to be the nominee in the first round of voting, then those folks become unbound in all subsequent rounds of voting at the national convention.
Sort of, thank you. Kind of two questions. And again, right, I'm asking you to suddenly be an elections expert. And recognizing that the answer might be a little different for the two major parties.
Yeah.
Does each vote count for one? Right, like in a Senate structure, right? So each state gets a vote of, right? So if California and Wyoming both vote for a particular candidate, does that vote count for one? Or is the delegates are split up relative to the state size?
No, it's a one vote per person, one vote per delegate, not delegation.
Okay. And and larger states have more delegates.
Yep.
Got it.
Yep.
So it looks more like yeah, okay. That makes sense.
And you got to understand that for each of the two major parties, we're talking about thousands of people. So I think in the most recent Democratic convention that we had just a few weeks ago, I want to say they were somewhere north of 3,500 delegates, getting close to 4,000 delegates, if not a little over 4. It's a lot of people.
So it is an interesting process because the delegates are bound, at least for the bound ones, are bound by the state process, whether that's a caucus or a primary, but they're also voting as individuals.
Yep.
So it's a popular vote, but it's also a popular vote in the sense that it's also connected to the state vote or whatever that process was for each state.
Yeah, and so at each of the nominating conventions, each of the national conventions, you see a lot of pageantry that's really focused on statehood. It's really focused on state delegations. And so for decades at these conventions, each state will make, this big splash where the state will, some party leader from that state will announce, the great state of whatever announces its support for, and then they name the candidate that their primary has chosen. It really does remind me of some sort of big pep rally.
Hmm. My understanding is that superdelegates do not vote in the first round of voting.
Um, on the Republican side, they do for sure. On the Democratic side, I don't know.
Think that I read, and again, I'm new to this. Let me go.
Yeah.
Let me go to the superdelegates. As a result, the party has superdelegates will no longer vote in the first, and this is on the Democratic side, right? Because this is describing
Yep.
the Democratic superdelegates. So superdelegates will no longer vote on the first ballot at the convention unless there is doubt about the outcome. I don't know how you determine that one way or another, but to win on the first ballot, the front runner must secure the majority of pledged delegates. So it's a simple majority. Is that
So
correct?
yeah, I
51%?
had I had forgotten that the Democrats made that change in 2020. You got to understand that a lot of these party rules are evolutionary.
Sure.
And so after any given election cycle, the party's leadership will come together, talk about how things went, talk about things they might want to change for the next iteration. And so, quite honestly, I think a lot of the party rules are arcane, and that's a bipartisan critique. I think both the R's and the D's have arcane rules for these nominating conventions. And so I had forgotten that the Democrats changed that rule for 2020. I'd forgotten about that. There was neat. There were a lot of folks worried about a floor fight at the Democratic convention in 2016. Well, that would have been a floor fight between Hillary Clinton and who would that have been?
Bernie Sanders.
Joe Biden.
Oh, Joe
So,
Biden.
yeah. And so, after that, in the run up to 2020, um, they decided to make a rules change.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you gotta keep in mind that frequently when we talk about political parties, we talk about them as though there's some sort of monolith, nationally. That's just not true. They're multifaceted organizations. They've got factions and groups within them. Some of them get along, some of them don't. And so after any given election cycle, those factions are going to be haggling over rules changes
Sure.
that they think would benefit their faction, maybe benefit the party as a whole in the next cycle to come.
Sure. Well, it makes sense. I would just think about it geographically, right? I mean, being in a Republican or Democratic Party in, say, Texas versus Montana versus New York versus California, right? I'm just sort
Yeah.
of grabbing four random areas of the country, right? I mean, or Wisconsin versus Arizona, right? And those are
Yeah.
very, very different places culturally. So it would make sense that the parties sort of differ in that sense.
Yeah. Agreed.
Well, this has been fascinating. Is there anything else I didn't cover that I should have asked about?
Um, who are these people?
Oh, yeah, I was
Uh,
going to ask that. Thank you for reminding me. Yeah, I
yeah.
was thinking that, like, so a delegate or a super delegate or unbound delegate, this is a person in the state. So if I went to, for example, if I went to either the Democrat or the Republican Party in the state of Idaho, which is where I live now, I could find, I'm assuming, the list of people. I'm assuming they are people who carry that role through the year.
Yeah. So each of the two major parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, they each try to um, honor the experience, if you will, the perspective might be a different way of thinking about it, of sitting politicians in the party. And then also people who have recently held positions of authority in the party. And so it's very, very common to see unbound delegates as current or former governors, current or former United States senators, current or former U.S. House members. Each will also typically name some sort of state level party official as an unbound delegate. And so they tend to call this a committee person, committee man, committee woman. And then they usually have another lesser position too at the state level, if not a couple of them. And so you can see where a less populated state, I'm just going to pick on the three that come to mind. Wyoming, Idaho, Alaska. We can throw in, Montana, the Dakotas just for fun. Lesser populated states are going to have a smaller list of unbound delegates because, well, you've got that other factor at play, the U.S. House of Representatives. So if you want to compare that list of more sparsely populated states to a list of very densely populated states, California, Texas, New York, Florida, their list of super delegates or unbound delegates, it's going to be a much longer list than those sparsely populated states.
Yeah.
Of course, there's going to be some variation between the two parties about how they choose who these people are. But the gist of it is this is party leadership. These are people that have achieved some sort of high level position in the state or at the national level, and they're members of that party. That's a really great way to think about it.
That makes sense.
I'm so sorry to cut you off. There's one more group of people that actually it's a small club, and that's why I forgot. Former presidents. Former presidents also get status as an unbound delegate.
Yeah,
that makes sense. Yeah, so living former presidents. Well, President Obama, President Trump, President George W. Bush. We've got a handful of former presidents still alive. For that matter, Jimmy Carter is still alive.
Carter's still alive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, Bill Clinton. Yeah.
Oh, and Clinton. Yeah. Historically, you mentioned, right, a potential floor fight. Are there historic examples? And I don't mean way back, right, historically, but more contemporary history where the delegate, super delegate sort of, and there was contestation at the convention itself, right? That is notable or helps us understand why this matters. Like, have either convention gone to a second round of voting in recent history, as an example?
So I'll start there. That I don't know. I'm not really familiar with the voting history across national conventions. Hopefully, one of our viewers out there will be like, "Oh, it's been this many."
That would be great to know.
But thinking about floor fights and delegates versus super delegates, since 1968 on the Democratic side, there have been a number of times where people speculated that the nomination race within the Democratic Party was going to be close enough that there might be a floor fight. And then there was some speculation that super delegates would weigh in one way or the other. So you see this play out a handful of times in fairly recent history. In the early 2000s, this was a fairly common conversation about within the context of the run-up to the Democratic National Convention. Mm-hmm. Also, you can see how rules changes were actually a downstream effect of people worrying, were the super delegates going to sway the nomination one way or the other? And then how would the people perceive it? Yeah. Would people out in the public perceive this as a bunch of party elites putting their thumb on the scale, so to speak? And, what would be the repercussions of that?
Yeah.
So I think the high point of superdelegate power on the Democratic side was about 20% of the vote. I think that was in 2000, but I may be wrong. And then we see it fluctuate basically between about 15% and about 20% of all delegate votes. Now I think they're down about 15%. On the Republican side, because of the rule that says they're bound anyway during the first round, you really don't see as much conversation. You don't see as much debate on the Republican side of things. Historically, the Republican Party has been the party that falls in line. And so the Republicans tend to fall in line, if you will, behind whoever their nominee is long before the convention. They just don't have the recent history of some sort of contentious convention that the Democrats have had over, say, the last, 80 years? Something like that.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very, very interesting.
Well, Jason, thank you very much. I learned a ton today. You helped. I mean, and I really was curious because I would listen to references of things in the media, and that's not a critique of the media per se. It's just the platform itself doesn't allow for a lot of explanation, right? I mean, we don't have time in the middle of a CNN broadcast, as an example, to sort of to do even a medium dive, much less a deep dive into the difference between an unbound and a super delegate, which I found out today are actually the same
Well,
thing. So,
well, and let's be honest, nothing I said is sound biteable. Nothing. Nothing I mentioned. Not a single thing. No, you're not going to find coverage on that.
no, which is sort of the space that we occupy, right? It's like we're interested in topics and let's explore them. So, thank you very much, Jason. I appreciate your time.
Hey, it's always fun. Hey, for all y'all watching, thanks so much for tuning in. We hope you tune in again very soon. Bye bye.
Bye bye.